Okay, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation. My name is John Clements. I'm the technical lead for the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center, or HDIAC, one of three IAC domains in the DoD Information Analysis Centers operating under the Defense Technical Information Center, or DTIC, within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Our informative webinar series highlights current and emerging research and technology developments. It presents an opportunity for accelerating the DoD's leverage of these advancements by increasing awareness and fostering technical collaboration. HDIAC serves as one of the premier information research partners and curators of technology advancements and trends for the Homeland Defense and Homeland Security communities. As such, our organization supports those working in the Homeland Defense and Security domain of DoD research and engineering. We do this by helping navigate the vast landscape of scientific and technical information, allowing our customers to get a head start on their technical projects. We provide research and analysis services to help unlock access to information, knowledge, and best practices from government, industry, and academia to stimulate innovation, foster collaboration, and eliminate redundancy. We hope you enjoy this webinar and that it serves as a catalyst for community collaboration and improved DoD Homeland Defense and Security research. Before we begin, I will note a couple of administrative items. First, if you are dialed in by phone and would like a copy of the slides, they were posted to the HDIAC webinar announcement. You can go to hdIAC.org/webinars and find today's webinar. When you click it at the bottom of the announcement, it will say to view the webinar PDF, click here. And you can download it from that link. Second, all participants are muted, but you can chat with the presenters and moderators using the chat box to the left. However, if you would like to pose a question for the Q&A session at the end, please use the audience questions tool at the top center of your screen. It is the icon that looks like a chat bubble with a question mark next to the emojis. At the end of the presentation, I will go over the Q&A, and for the benefit of those of the phone, I'll read the question out loud to the presenter, and he will provide an answer. If you have a technical issue during the presentation, have no fear. The full presentation will be available online. You can check back on the HDIAC website. Once the webinar is posted, the go to webinar button will take you to a YouTube link where the video will be posted. Without further ado, I will introduce today's presenter. Our presenter is Mr. Jeremy Prout from International SOS. He's the Security Director for Americas. As Security Director Americas for International SOS, Jeremy is responsible for providing security assistance and support for organizations throughout the globe. Jeremy has an extensive background in crisis management and overseas security operations. He has also supported International SOS clients through a number of crises, including leading evacuation and assistance efforts for natural disasters throughout the Americas region. Prior to joining International SOS, Jeremy served as security manager for several premier organizations. Jeremy served for 6 years as a Marine Corps officer, specializing in overseas security, training, and risk management. And with that, Jeremy, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for taking the time to join us here to have this important discussion about critical infrastructure protection, especially looking at this in, hopefully eventually soon enough, the post-pandemic world that we are continuing to strive to get to. Something that I wanted to add a little bit more about myself. So additionally, on top of what John mentioned about my background, I also worked in critical infrastructure protection for a number of organizations in NERC and FERC. So really looking at electrical reliability. And one of the things that, certainly came up with that is, how do we do these types of things during a crisis? How do we adjust our business as usual, for critical infrastructure protection, when we deal with, these larger than life issues that come up. I'll start off with a bit of an analogy. And I'm a big fan of analogies when we talk about crises and what the impacts are. So I'd like to start off with this. Picture that there is a big storm that comes out. Something, and this could be a fish storm, right? So we're in that hurricane season right now. and we got a lot of these going on in the Gulf. So if you were to go put your line in and go fishing on a regular day, you have a general idea on what you're going to reel in. You generally know what you're going to catch, what you're not going to catch. Get an idea of kind of what that baseline normal looks like. Now the change obviously happens when we do have that storm, right? So when something does happen and it really chews up the ocean, mixes things up, that's when we put that hook in, and we can certainly get surprised by what we catch and what we don't catch. And that's very much what we see when we have one of these massive crisis events. And this is a bit of we've called a black swan event, one of those very large crisis events that we don't see coming. And obviously with COVID-19 and the primary, secondary, tertiary impacts of this, this is something that has now been going for well over a year and a half, and has made a real impact on not only the risk landscape, but the other considerations that are out there. What has been the impact to organizations, to individuals, and how critical infrastructure works in general. So where we're at now is when we deal with a crisis event, we are dealing with a crisis within a crisis. And that's where we're at with COVID-19. So this can be anything that we have going on. This could be a cybersecurity incident. Well, why is that cybersecurity incident more difficult on the 15th of September 2021 than it was in 2019? Because we also have a component of our cyber infrastructure that is working with our remote employees. We have parts of our emergency operations systems, of our infrastructure protection, which is being utilized in other locations. I'll give you an adage recently that I think we're all familiar with, the events that have been happening in Afghanistan. Part of what International SOS does is supporting evacuation. So one of the individuals that we had to evacuate was a 19-year-old male who was an incoming freshman at a university. And after trying to get this individual through multiple Taliban checkpoints over days, we finally got that individual to a third country safe haven in Qatar, and then had to work very hard to get that individual out of a 7-day COVID quarantine. And that individual, the last thing that we need that we want to do right now is to have a situation where a person who's in a traumatic event is now in a COVID quarantine. So that gets into the situation where, again, we're dealing with this crisis in a crisis, and we're not able to support things in the way that we typically want to, or our response protocols and our considerations for how we deal with risk always has to consider this additional public health issue that's out there. And that's the reality of the world that we're living in now as critical infrastructure protection professionals. And that's, what we're going to be dealing with as far as that change management as this continues to go on. Because even when we do hit this post-pandemic process, and I know that we're all very much looking forward to throwing out masks. I know maybe some of you did what I did a few months ago, or maybe 4 or 5 months ago, which is to toss a bunch of masks, and now I found myself going on Amazon and buying some more. But when we're finally at the point where, this is an endemic, where that public health crisis is over, we are also going to have a very different landscape. So what are the things that are going to change? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in my conclusion, but, what are our bricks and mortars going to be? So historically, we had a lot of individuals, or especially from critical infrastructure protection, a significant amount of our workforce that is on site. As I'm sure many of you know, just bringing individuals who are those SIP professionals into the home workspace where maybe they haven't been before, that's an immense challenge. It's an immense challenge from a cyber perspective, from dealing with our employees and making sure that they have the proper infrastructure. And it also, has changed, where our people are. So I'll give you an example. I'm speaking to you from Hoboken, New Jersey. And that's North Jersey, right outside of Manhattan. If an organization had an office in Manhattan, they'd probably have people coming in on a daily basis from within New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, maybe another state from some of more of those long hauls as well. But what's going to be the change coming forward? We now have a much more dispersed population. So the risk environments have changed, and our landscape as far as what our organizations are, those have changed as well. So what does that mean? That means that our risk models are very uncertain. What are the risks that we see coming up? How are they going to present themselves? And we're going to talk about some of these in our emerging risks as we go on, but those are very uncertain. I just think back to the George Floyd protest back in May and June of last year. That's a very good example of, again, that crisis within a crisis. But how those protests came about, the speed of which, and some of obviously those protests were occurring for very good reasons, but some of the emotional parts behind it, the push against authority, certainly had some additional backing of the frustrations around the pandemic and judgments about how government has, or in many cases has not, responded properly to that. What does that mean? That means that our risks are going to be different. Those risks that are out there are going to present themselves different than they historically have. Emerging risks, that's a similar situation as well. So we're seeing, and we'll cover those down, where those are going to be presenting differently. And this is something that I'm going to hit on in the conclusion, but I wanted to bring it up in the introduction. What does this mean for us in critical infrastructure protection? It means that we really need to do a comprehensive reassessment of risk. So not just security risk, not just those threats, those man-made issues that are out there, everything from cybersecurity, active shooter events, but all the way down to how we deal with extreme weather events, and how we deal with safety as well. And I'll give you this example. I'll bring it up. Workplace violence. We always have a pretty clear picture of what that looks like. I can't imagine that any of you from critical infrastructure protection don't have a policy around workplace violence. Now, that being said, as we see more individuals move from that traditional workplace and get into the home office, guess what? A domestic violence situation is now a workplace violence incident. Now, I challenge that the majority of the organizations out there have not done a workplace violence update to include domestic violence, even if they now have a very large and robust and permanent remote workforce. So that's just an example of the many ways that we need to do a reassessment of those risks, to look at what are the mitigations and policies that we have now, and to say, are they appropriate for the changes in these threats that are out there and the changes in the hazards and our ability to respond to them. And then finally, as critical infrastructure protection professionals, the last part is, what is our role? And boy, I'm probably preaching the choir here for individuals that over the last year and a half plus have been doing a lot of work that they never thought they were before. I think we all have our Google degrees in epidemiology at this point, something that I never thought I would know as much about viruses as I do. And hopefully I don't have to learn this all again at a later date. But our roles have changed, and we need to realize that, and we need to also understand that a lot of those changes are going to be permanent, and there are also things that we still need to do. And I'm going to hit this on the last one. So I talked about a black swan event, right? So this is that outlier, especially those low probability but high impact issues. So having a public health crisis, is that something that we need to look at and say, okay, hey, this is definitely a situation where we're in that situation of it's at the pandemic that we're now. Sure, this is a black swan. It's that anomaly. But having a public health crisis, especially a global one, so this is the fourth one since 2009. So this is not new. Am I saying that we're going to have another pandemic like COVID? No, I don't think so. But are we going to be dealing with these in other places, both domestically and internationally? Yes, there is no doubt about that. That is the gray rhino. That's the thing that we should be expecting, and we need to be preparing for that as well. So let's talk a bit about emerging risks and kind of what we're seeing so far and what we need to be prepared for. So civil unrest is definitely a big one, and this is something that we had seen trends, and I'll run through this in some slides in a bit. But we had seen an uptick on this not only domestically in the United States but globally, and I'll talk about a little bit more about why. But at a high level, the ability to organize individuals, the ability to spread information through the internet, especially through social media. To get people together, to give them information, and that information oftentimes is not accurate, right? Is quick. It's going to happen very fast. And we are able to see the mobilization of individuals, in locations, and to do it in large numbers and to do it in a fashion that is, very tactical in nature. And the best example I've seen on this is probably Hong Kong. Going back, especially to 2018, 2019, individuals effectively communicating over social media, being able to show up at locations and then immediately changing that protest location. So by the time local law enforcement got to a place, they've already changed up their tactics and their protocols. So we're basically seeing an area that has a lot of potential to disturb. But the ability to make changes. So historically, civil unrest, something that we know about, we know it's coming, we know the numbers, the ability to predict it, and the ability of those individuals that are conducting it to make those critical changes is incredibly enhanced. Next up is financial impacts. So obviously, when we start seeing impacts on finances, that's going to drive instability. So what does that mean? That means all kinds of problems. And from the group that we're talking about here, probably for a lot of you, that means things like precious metal theft, people breaking into sites, increases in vagrancy, and really those financial impacts of things like petty theft that can make a massive impact on a substation. I worked for a client that was a massive water utility provider, and helping them out with issues. The biggest problem that they had was metal theft. When you look at areas that are going to be depressed, that are depressed, and some of these financial impacts we've felt now, some of them still may be coming in the years to follow. We're going to feel those directly at our sites. Then cybersecurity. Cyber. This is probably the biggest gap that I think is out there. We saw a lot of issues with ransomware for many organizations, and as we know, from a critical infrastructure protection perspective, SIP, that's always a target. That's a nation-state target. It's a terrorist target. It's someone in their basement playing around and trying to do some things target as well. So looking at the workforce that we have now, and again, that workforce has definitely changed, and I'll get right on that workforce in a minute. How many of our policies around cybersecurity had a really good change, or policies, procedures, protocols with the change in the pandemic and the workforce? When you're operating in a crisis, trying to figure out how we address and make sure that we shore up those other areas is incredibly difficult. I've seen a lot of organizations struggle to do this because they're still playing catch up with the remote workforce. How do we make sure that they're efficient? And there's no doubt we're seeing an uptick in malware, in ransomware, in human engineering around these things, because individuals who are working remotely are not going to be as sharp when it comes to cybersecurity as they are at the office. There's just no doubt about it. If staying at home in a more relaxed environment, more casually dressed, you're going to be more likely to make those mistakes and to do the wrong things. And finally, on workforce, I think for many of us, we look towards those federal guidelines on how do we deal with a remote workforce. Well, the challenge that's out there is there really isn't much that's out there. I believe the last update that OSHA had is from about 1997 on the remote worker, what needs to be in place for them, and there isn't a lot there. Now, I think a lot of that's going to change in the next couple of years, and really needs to, and there may be some of the regulations that you all as SIP professionals are dealing with already, and changes that you're seeing, and that's great. But for many of the organizations that I'm dealing with, for many of the industries, we're not seeing that big change from an infrastructure protection on sealing up this gap on that remote workforce from a cyber perspective, as well as ensuring that from an OSHA perspective, and just from making sure that our people are safe in the places that they're at. I'm not seeing those regulations catch up as much yet. I want to highlight a little bit globally. If you do have some global impacts, some of the changes that are out there. So obviously, COVID-19 has really bounced around the globe. It's been a whack-a-mole approach that's having a lot of impact. Right now we're seeing a lot of shutdown as far as the lack of mobility in APAC. A good amount, and again that whack-a-mole approach, right? So seeing different locations have different spikes at different times, different rollouts on vaccination programs. So, really here we've seen APAC be a bit ahead of the curve as far as pandemic response in a lot of ways, and that gets into the ability to impact societal restrictions and make requirements of individuals. But it's a lot of questions are about how some of these players, particularly South Korea, are going to emerge out of this pandemic. As far as China and South Korea are going to emerge outside this pandemic. Sub-Saharan Africa. So, different parts have been hit harder than others, but certainly, financial impacts are a major concern there from the long term. We are not seeing, vaccine rollouts the way that we'd like to see them in that location. Are a lot of struggles that are going in there. So, the potential for that to, continue to be a really hot spot from COVID-19, driving instability, driving problems, is something that we're certainly aware of. Looking at Middle East and North Africa. So looking at, there are plenty of problems in these locations. We have a lot of, just looking at maybe going back 10 years ago, where are the places that the United States had diplomatic representation? Going back, thinking, Libya, although obviously with the events of in Benghazi, that changed. But seeing the changes in where we have representation and what that map looks like and what the ruling governments are and what failed states there are, there is a lot of instability in that region. So if you are in a position where your organization, your entity, your field has some sort of a footprint or potentially an impact from Middle East, North Africa, or Sub-Saharan, a lot of concerns there. And then lastly, LATAM. So a lot of challenges around COVID-19, particularly in Brazil, a lot of issues around some locations like Chile, which had a significant amount of political instability coming into COVID. Same thing with Cuba. We're seeing that pushback, right? So again, getting back to that crisis within a crisis, everything's a little bit more difficult. Civil unrest, a little bit more emotion behind it, a little bit more judgment on government because we can easily point to those numbers on COVID, those financial impacts, those freedoms that we've lost. So we certainly are seeing a lot of instability in the LATAM region as well. And then finally, looking at Europe, the breakup of parts of the EU, some of that coming back together on the pandemic as far as restrictions go, but really, still a very big question on kind of those coalitions that have traditionally exist that we're not seeing as much from a European perspective. And then, similar to what I've covered down from emerging risks from a global look, civil unrest. So the United States is not the only location that is struggling with this. We're seeing this in many different locations as well, especially LATAM. But we've seen protest activity Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, India, Hong Kong. We have a number of upcoming locations with elections in 2022. So that's going to continue to be a problematic area going forward. Again, those financial impacts, similar to what we talked about domestically, we're going to see those show up in different locations. A change I'll say is on extremism. So the ability for governments, for even at that more local level, to deal with extremists when we have a pandemic, when we have a crisis going on. That military, that police, that local law enforcement, those emergency management services, they're focused on pandemics, which creates situations where we can see an uptick in other issues. So seeing upticks in activities in Mozambique, in Nigeria's northeast area, Burkina Faso, Chad as well, the Philippines, Indonesia. These are areas that certainly extremism can take advantage of lapses in emergency management, lapses in security, as well as to hook on to grievances and to make those something as an anti-government look, and to then mobilize additional actors to create these situations, which really again gets us into things like violent crime. One of the things that I talk about when it comes to Mexico is, like any business out there, a cartel is still going to have to make money, right? So if you think about just the movement of vehicles, of the lack of mobility that exists currently across the U.S. border, what does that mean? A cartel, they can catapult drugs, they can do human smuggling, they can tunnel. Those are, maritime. Those are some of just the many ways that they can do it. But if you need to make your number, what you have to also look at is, what do we need to do domestically? So upticks in fuel theft in Mexico. Definitely situations where critical infrastructure is targeted. So we're seeing those impacts from organized crimes happening in Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, and many other locations where they're taking advantage of the financial impacts, the power vacuums, as well as being organizations just like any, unfortunately, I hate to call them businesses, but ones that run on the bottom line, which is the dollar, still needing to make those numbers. So having to utilize additional kidnapping, additional extremist activity, violent crime to drive their revenue up when that revenue is lost during the pandemic. All right, so what I'd like to do now is just to talk through these various areas, and as I go, please take note of, because we're going to leave time at the end for your outstanding questions. So, if I missed something, if you want to talk more about it, I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end. I hope you are. So just a friendly reminder to, start taking down those questions. So workforce, again, work from home is part of that workforce. And from a critical infrastructure protection perspective, it may not be as large as others, but certainly I know plenty of people, especially in the energy sector, that are doing these jobs remotely. And maybe that had been 1 or 2 days a week. Now we're seeing a lot of people doing it, 4 to 5. And again, we have these cybersecurity vulnerabilities that are out there. Behavior is a big one that we can put in. We can put in a robust patch management program. We can do a lot of trainings. We need to continue to train the individual. Again, there is no doubt whatsoever that people are more relaxed about security when they're at home. They're more relaxed about cyber in particular. They're more likely to, take a phone call from somebody who is, IT help desk that has a question or needs to do an install on their computer. We very much need to continue to train our individuals on the proper, the proper ways of dealing with these things. We need to test them, especially. This is a great time to be doing that testing. And again, I know that we all have other priorities as it goes with cyber and dealing with the pandemic, but this remote workforce is not going away. We really need to catch up at this point to make sure that we're handling this properly. Workplace violence and domestic violence. So again, I brought this up in the introduction. This is a situation, if you have a workplace violence policy that doesn't have a consideration for your remote workforce, you need to fix that. That needs to get updated. Again, if somebody is dealing with a domestic situation, and we've all seen this present at an office before, where someone shows up, someone shows up and they've been the victim of domestic violence, or that domestic partner is showing up at the workplace, and now that's a domestic situation that's escalated to workplace. Here's the thing: if someone shows up, if someone looks startled, if someone maybe is bruised, if they're having that domestic violence situation, how likely is someone going to be able to see that over Zoom? Unlikely. If someone is having an issue, we're not having the same interactions that we're having before. So a lot of those things that go into our employee assistance programs, our workplace violence programs, those mitigations aren't what they used to be for that remote workforce. We need to go in and update those policies, update those trainings to be able to understand that change in dynamic, because it is a big one. Same thing with layoffs and furloughs. So hopefully, I think for many organizations, this is very much going the other way. But let's be honest, we still have to deal with layoffs. We have to deal with terminations, especially from a remote perspective. How are we turning off an individual's access when that happens? How do we restrict those rights if we know that someone is going to get laid off, because they may know that as well, if they are going to be terminated? So how do we catch up to that? Other things, mental health issues. Last year and a half, globally, you got to figure 80% of the people are having the most challenging year of their life, right? If it's not 80%, it's got to be close. And even if it's not that, it's a challenging year, which means it's a long one. We're having mental health issues. That's a workforce consideration that every organization needs to start investing into as well. And finally, from a SIP perspective, I'm sure many of you have felt this already, the supply chain impact. This gets into casting a rather wide net on those threats and hazards and the pandemic and what's changed, and understanding what is out there from a supply chain perspective. What do I need? And this can be something as simple as, it's hurricane season, there's a storm coming, we need to do some preparations for one of our sites, and lumber isn't available, or tarps aren't available, or just the many things that are out there that we traditionally depend upon. All right, civil unrest. So we saw this, an uptick on this May and June. We saw this protest activity around the 2020 election. We saw protest activity, following the election. A big protest, or supposedly a big protest, is planned for the 18th. So the fencing around the Capitol Hill has gone. So we've gotten used to protest activity, but certainly I think with the pandemic, we're definitely seeing a heightened level of emotion on these things, because people are more emotional. If you just go on Twitter or social media and do what I do, which is take some level of interest in watching people get kicked off airplanes for not wearing masks, we can tell that people are charged up. Getting back to that last point I made on the previous slide on mental health, people are emotional. There's no doubt about it. So that's going to create situations where protests are more easily spiked. And that can also be protests against critical infrastructure. So that could be environmental issues. It could be some kind of a reputational situation that comes up. It could be something that's zoning related. But we have to pay attention to the fact that a protest, civil unrest can appear much faster. And I use civil unrest as a catch-all term for everything from just minor protests all the way to riots and those types of activity. Civil unrest can happen quick. It spreads over social media quick. It changes fast, and it's very hard to tell what is that big event that's going to happen and what is not. Social media monitoring should be part of your program now. Maybe not at the level where we're monitoring employees. That's not what I'm talking about, but understanding who your adversaries are, what their profiles are, and to have a general idea on, what are their trends, what are their approaches, and what are the things that they're doing. Because keeping up with your adversary is something that we very much need to look at. as this continues to be a very fast-moving trend. This is something that was put together by the Control Risk Group, and this just gives you an idea. This is not something that is just pandemic-led, and it's something that we've seen globally. As you can see here, incidents in civil unrest worldwide from Jan of 2014 up until October of 2019, so really right around that pre-pandemic situation there. We've seen that uptick, over the years. This is definitely a growing risk trend that you need to be paying attention to, that SIP needs to know about, but really, for security professionals in general, we need to keep an eye on going forward. Cyber threats. So this is probably the one, and I'd be curious when we get into Q&A if you also have some answers for me on what your biggest threat is. But from the majority of conversations I've had with clients, the cyber landscape is one that we've seen a lot of challenges with. And many of that is, I'll get into kind of cyber terrorism in a minute, but the landscape has changed because, how we work has changed. I won't hammer that nail anymore as far as, that remote worker and how vulnerable they are, but there is no doubt that having a remote dispersed workforce, having that go in a matter of weeks from, maybe having 10%, 5% of that workforce to having, 50, 60% of that workforce go remote, we are probably still playing catch up with what the best practices are on that. We need to do that, but guess what? The adversary, they have not. They are using tactics, techniques, and protocols. They share information incredibly quickly, and this has become a very profitable endeavor. Just to give you an idea, looking back a couple of years ago, when you have a ransomware situation, especially for something that was going to shut down an organization for, maybe 3 or 4 days, you're talking about, maybe $30,000 worth of the asking price. So this wasn't a big ask before, but now we're definitely seeing a major impact on, what that ask is from that ransomware. So it's 30 or 50,000. Now it's 3 million. So we've definitely seen a really big uptick in the number of these that are coming along. But we're also seeing, that ransomware, changing as far as, the amount that's asked for. And I'm speaking to the audience that knows the Colonial pipeline ransomware attack that happened back in May of this year better than I do. But, just a perfect example of, one single point of failure from one password, created this entire situation. And then that requested ransom was approximately 75 Bitcoin, which comes out to, depending on the exchange, somewhere between $4 and $5+ million. This is not going away. So, we saw this in the 2020 SolarWinds hack. We've seen this in just about every government agency, every single one of you, including me. Our information has been hacked at some point. Either if you don't think it's happened, it has happened. You just don't know about it yet. This is a very profitable industry. And as we also look from this from the terrorist perspective, this is a landscape that is not tied to a physical perspective, right? So you look at something like ISIS, we look at ISK that's popped up in Afghanistan now. Holding physical landscape has a vulnerability to it. That doesn't exist in that cyber world. So as you see, a fall of a caliphate or a rise in a caliphate, as we see in IS, in Khorasan, and as we're generally can see, as well as the extreme right, the extreme left, this is a space where they can really play, and this is more of an even playing ground because they do have that training. When we look at things like the deep web and particularly the dark web, these are individuals that are high skill individuals that are in a realm where there are not those types of boundaries that we see in the physical world. So that creates a situation where they have the capacity to do more, and they have very much that anonymity to do more as well. Now, obviously, we're working to change that, but what this means is this threat, whether it be just that simple ransomware situation, or that threat of a terrorist or an extremist group, that is just growing as we go on. Just to give you some of the things that we've seen already, personal identification, PII, that being developed into kill lists, defacement of government and critical infrastructure websites, denial of service attacks. We're also seeing this growth from the state-sponsored as well. So, state actors, North Korea, China, supporting groups as well. And there's always the question of, what does a cyber 9/11 look like? What is the situation when something besides just a pipeline shutdown happens, where we have a massive attack, especially on something like the grid, and that we have those long-term impacts? How bad could these things go? We need to consider what that is and really be ready for it. All right, so I have a few more comments, and then again, I'm going to open up for your outstanding questions. So changing, just some considerations on geopolitical shifts as well. So changing U.S. role in foreign affairs, very much up in the air. A lot of changes that we saw in the previous administration, seeing a lot of changes already in this administration as far as what the U.S. role is going to be. Those growth of those other state actors that are out there, particularly Russia and China, having growth in Central Asia and Africa. Again, even if you're a domestic organization and you're not looking so much on those impacts directly to you, supply chain, something you have to think about, as well as those cyber perspectives as well. And supply chain, if you don't know about the Belt and Road Initiative of China, I'm sure you've seen many discussions about what China's role is going to be, going to be in Afghanistan, but that growth, it has a lot of potential to impact the supply chain for our organizations for critical infrastructure. And finally, traditional coalitions that we've seen, the ones especially that we saw very strong in the 1990s coming into the early 2000s. But NATO, a lot of changes in what NATO is now, the EU. Many of these traditional coalitions are in turmoil, and we're not seeing, what I consider a mitigation, which is these coalitions that have really helped out the globe as far as peaceful operations, with plenty of problems. But just look back to the growth in coalitions post World War II. Those don't exist the way that they used to, which creates possibly for a lot of turmoil. All right, so these are going to be my conclusions. So what now? So first off, you got to know your assets. So your people, understand who your people are, where they are. Do we have a more displaced workforce? Do we have to be thinking about that? What's our not just what's our bricks and mortar, our locations, our offices, but what are our interests and impacts? From a perspective of what are the kind of downstream relationships that your organization, that your industry has with others that could be impacted by a risk event someplace else. Doing a threat assessment or a risk assessment. My advice is to cast a very wide net. Again, when we're in a crisis within a crisis, everything is more difficult. So really cast a wide net on what are the things that, where are the places that our organization could be vulnerable. Don't just think about your site, think about your region, where are you working in? Think about your peer group as well. If you have a situation where, you're working within a mutual aid society, how can they be impacted additionally? And always be asking the question, when we do see an emerging threat, how could we potentially be vulnerable to this? Next thing up, you are not alone, right? So I talked about, those associations, those mutual aid organizations. I'm sure I'm speaking to an audience that knows very much about this, but, make sure that you're reaching out to others within your industry. Again, feel free to cast a wide net. Start talking to other people because they're dealing with the same problems and potentially coming up with better solutions that you may. So you definitely want to reach out to them as well. Looking at your existing mitigation. So what have we already done? So what have we already done for our remote workforce? What have we done on cyber? What do we have coming up? what are the assumptions that we made? That's something that we absolutely need to question, because I'll be honest with you, I don't know a single person who's looking glass on COVID or the risk landscape has been particularly accurate in the last year and a half. All right, so some ways to enhance preparedness: monitoring. We need reliable information. Infodemic is out there. It's not just on on vaccines and COVID and everything else, but it is difficult to get reliable and timely information at this point. Monitoring, we need to be doing this frequently, whether that be on cyber, whether that's going to be on the risk landscape. That's something that needs to happen. We also have to have a good capacity to digest as an organization, which means, as SIP professionals, taking this information and making sure that at the lowest level, those individuals can digest it properly. Business BCP and disaster recovery, having a very clear mapping of your people and assets. Again, just thinking about that Manhattan example that I had before. I have clients that had people in 3 states before. Now they have them in 23 states. You have clients that never had issues with wildfires before, never cared much about them until they realized that they have some remote workers on the West Coast, and now that's something that is a concern about them. Having clear site-specific triggers on what we're going to do. Again, when we're in a crisis situation, what do we want to do? We want to map these things out. When we're in a crisis within a crisis, we want to have specific triggers and good hard planning. Simple plans, but with specific triggers for what are the things that we do at what point. And the other thing is always asking, so what's next? What are we going to do next? Response planning, just some things that you want to consider doing a good update. Civil unrest. How do we deal with that at one of our locations? Incident response, how do we respond for everything from a workplace violence incident on site in the home, but also cybersecurity as well. And things like evacuation planning. And this can be, something I'm seeing a lot of the challenges around this as far as movements during hurricane season with clients, because we do a lot of evacuation planning. Everything is much harder during a pandemic. Finally, training and communication. We need to train to the lowest level of our organization. We need to effectively communicate to them. People in an infodemic, they are very much looking for good, reliable information, and the place that they're looking for is you. You are the individuals that they want that information from, and that's not everybody, and I certainly recognize that. But if people don't trust media, and you can't trust social media, that we already know. Governments can oftentimes be a big question mark. Also, getting good information from your organization, that's definitely a plus. Enhanced oversight and preparation. Again, we want to doing everything within a crisis is more difficult, so we want to enhance what our mitigations are ahead of time. And proactive communication, especially if we are dealing with a protest activity, but proactive communication on anything. We have a hurricane coming up. It might impact us. 2 years ago, hey, we'll let local news take that. Well, guess what? Local news isn't as interested in talking about, Cat 2 as much as they used to do. So that falls on us as risk professionals, as SIP professionals, to put out there as well. And with that, that's going to be it for me. But I'm looking forward to taking your questions now. And John, I think I'll turn it over to you to kind of read those out, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. And I have a few questions up here, and I'm going to show them on the screen, and I'll read them out loud so that the folks on the phone can hear as well. So first question actually came from me. Wanted to know, what recommendations do you have for a workplace violence policy as it relates to the remote workforce?
Yeah. So starting off on that one, I spoke a bit about it, but here's my deliberate thing. It's going to be, how do we deal with that? What's the process when we find out that there is a domestic violence situation? There's not a clear, like OSHA policy, and some of you, hopefully, you've gotten that guidance from some of the compliance organizations that are out there. I'm gonna say probably not. But the first part you want to do is say how are we as an organization going to address that, right? So if we find out that that there's a domestic situation in that location, how are we going to define that? That's a conversation that is not that security can't be alone in. General counsel needs to be in that, human resources, and potentially that may require you bringing up to whatever entity sets your standards for critical infrastructure protection. So that's at a high level, but you're going to need to bring in a lot of individuals to deal with a very difficult and nuanced situation, because domestic situations, they are difficult, and the problem is maybe it spills in the workplace before, but the way that we've dealt with it historically has been a little bit of human resources. And again, if that domestic partner shows up, now it's a workplace situation. But I think first we need to recognize that happens, and then secondly, make a decision on what, as an organization, are we comfortable, and what's our duty to our employee to establish something to protect them as well.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the next question from Melanie Moore. Do you believe the increase in civil unrest is a permanent change or just a current trend?
Yeah, great question. So thanks for that, Melanie. Yeah, I definitely think it's so it's always been there, but the level of it, it's just the uptick's significant, and I don't think that some of the emotions behind it will change. Again, I don't want to speak down to any protest activity, because I think all of them have some level of legitimate grievances going to be in there. But again, using that airport, people getting tossed up airplanes, which happens. I don't know what the stats are, but someone talked to me about them the other day. They're significant. That's up because people are charged up. Civil unrest is going to be up because people are charged up. But based on social media and the impact and what you can do from there, how quickly people can find out about, let's say, a reputational issue for an entity, that's just, the speed on that's significant. The other thing is the ability to organize people via social media. Forget it. You can do this. Something can trend before someone even is able to find out if it's accurate or not. You can have a trend, and then someone's setting up a group, and next thing you know, your location has 40 protesters disturbing your site, and you're as almost as clueless as they are as to exactly why they're there. So that's definitely something that I think is going to be a permanent change on not the existence of it, but the speed at which it can happen, and the amount. It's almost like a blitz, right? You're going to have a lot thrown at you in a very little time. And what does that do? That creates chaos. So, what I'd say to this, Melanie, is, yes, I think it's going to be a permanent change. And I think what that requires from us is we really have to have those plans in place. And again, we need to look at who we're training, because it can't just be security anymore. So excellent question. Thank you.
Great. Now I'm going to, this question just came in, but I'm going to move it to the top because we do have an international audience.
Great.
Yeah, I wanted to address, what is OSHA, which is pronounced or spelled OSHA.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Adele, thank you very much for asking that. So Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So that's a regulatory agency of the U.S. Department of Labor. And what they submitted, they create really, which is workplace safety issues, right? So for instance, having a proper, setup at your desk is something that OSHA is looking at, making sure that people are wearing ear protection, or eye protection, or a fluorescent vest, hard hats. Those are the things. Most recently, for the U.S., there's COVID requirements around vaccination and testing that OSHA is going to be bringing out, which is going to be quite a lot of work for the Department of Labor to be doing. So that's what OSHA is. When we look at it from especially the changes on that remote workforce, again, 1997 is the last time that OSHA put out a guidance document on remote workforce. So I mean by, some of the challenges around this is, we don't have, a lot of the infrastructure that we'd hoped that federal government would put together in the United States actually hasn't happened yet for those remote workers. And some of the changes that, I think I'd like to have seen already from this pandemic, we haven't seen that yet.
All right, thank you. Next question sent in by Jim Miska. Civil unrest charts. Mm-hmm. You show charts for some regions where unrest is expected. Does that trend hold true for more stable nations such as the U.S., Canada, and Western Europe?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Great question. Yes, we definitely have those impacts. So I had that chart from something I was doing more on a global piece. But yeah, we've seen that uptick in protest activity in the U.S. We definitely see it, maybe not so much from the 2014 on, but plenty of that. But again, I think it's not so much the grievances that individuals have, although the emotion is definitely more there over the last year and a half. But again, it's the speed that something happens, right? So let's look back a little bit to the George Floyd protest. 10 years ago, we don't have a crowd of people taking a video of that on a cell phone. So does that protest happen? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I don't think it does. And you look at the speed of which that protest happened, not only in the location that happened, the geographic location, but then we saw this protest happen in, globally, right? So we saw it in France, we saw it in Asia, we saw it in Hong Kong. This went everywhere. So it's definitely something that I think is going to hold true for very much for stable nations, because when you look at the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, we're also not seeing the restrictions. A government can easily just squash, shut. Ethiopia can pull the plug on the internet, which they do. You can't do that in the U.S. You can't do that in Canada. You can't do that in Western Europe. So that's a big driver of what we're seeing, and that's definitely there to stay. But great question. Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Next question comes from Eric Carlson. He asks, how do you see Dropper as a service impacting critical infrastructure and being used for cyber revenge?
Yeah. As far as cyber revenge, I'm not so much, I don't know how much I see as cyber revenge. I definitely, Dropper from that ransomware perspective, definitely seeing that more. I think if we want to look at it from, ransomware, as well as, I guess, from that, if we're looking at from the adversary perspective, I definitely think there's an uptick in that from the, any of denial of service or ransomware tools, malware. I'd say they're all going up. We're all going to see an uptick in these malicious softwares coming into different locations, and because they have different access points that are out there. And the other thing from Dropper, Dropper obviously, for those who don't know, so that's really dropping in, like a worm or some piece of a malware, a malicious software on a device, and we've seen an uptick on that in cellular devices as well. So I definitely think, Eric, you got it right, because you're probably seeing the same thing I am. As we expand out on devices, I think Dropper is definitely something that we're going to see more, showing up on phones, other tools that are out there, and then making their way through our critical infrastructure systems. And then the question is, what not so much do we see it impacting more, but what's the point for it? Is it ransomware? Is it some kind of someone looking to take down the grid? But yeah, we've seen plenty of these, and I think that's just on the uptick. Thank you.
Great. Do you have time for any more questions? Because we're almost at the 1 p.m. mark. I just want to make sure.
I have as much time as you all do, so happy to stay on.
Okay. I'll keep going with the questions, so we continue to get a couple more in. If anybody does need to drop off, obviously nobody here works for me, so but I'll keep going. So this question comes from Brian Nuss. He asks, can you offer any advice or best practices on bridging the gaps between government-owned critical infrastructure protection assets and those that it may be maybe privately owned but has equity?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, that is a tricky one. I think we saw some of this. We saw some of this in Texas. It always ends up being a situation where something is covered under SIP guidance, SIP guidelines, and then maybe that privately owned entity is not as much. So probably best practices on kind of bridging those two, I think is that mutual aid society. So if you are a government entity, bringing in those private entities as well to and talking about this, right? And let's bring those. Let's say that we're on that government side, or maybe it's the other side. Let's look at how do we educate each other about what those challenges are. And I've been a member of OSAC and DSAC, a number of other of those public-private partnerships. The best way to do it is to educate each other, right? Bring in people from the private sector and explain, here are the challenges that we're having. Bring in someone from the public sector, and let's have those conversations as well. Getting somebody from the FBI or a federal agency to really dig into what we're seeing. I can guarantee you those individuals drop of a hammer. They'd love to come on and have more discussions with especially private entities about what those challenges are. So let's start those mutual aid societies, or let's widen the attendees on them, the distro on that, and let's train each other better.
Great. Okay. And the next question comes from Al Brzezinski. He asked, do you feel it is important for organizations to have an alternate internal and external website that can be stood up during a crisis as part of their crisis commo plan? If so, why?
Yeah, thanks, Al. Great question. So from a BCP perspective, I think it's really going to depend on what's on that site and what you're looking to put up there and some of the considerations. Because obviously, if we have there's there are pros and cons there, right? So we want to make sure that redundant site that's going to come out there is going to be up to date and is going to be able to do things that we want to. We want to make sure that is secure as well, because that also can be an entry point for malicious software, for malicious actors. Is a backdoor on our BCP and disaster recovery, and that does happen. So I absolutely want to have redundancies in place in a crisis, and I want to have that in that crisis communication plan, which you called out so well in here as well. So that's everything from phone trees to how do we make calls? What happens if if email goes down because the server's down and we're doing old school, actually having to call a human being on the phone, maybe even on a landline. So I think it's something that you want to look at within your organization. But I think there's a lot of considerations that we may want to take as far as what's the utilization of it, and also what is that redundant website potentially open us up to as far as a risk going.
Great. Our next question, another one from Adil Khan. Has anyone mapped sources of discontent on a region by region basis?
Yeah, great question. I haven't, but as far as looking at what are the I'm trying to think of this as maybe from a human perspective, what are the grievances, what's the areas. I don't think we've done so much on a mapping of what it is from location to location. I think what we look at is from the forecast perspective, so what's coming up, and I think if you look at individual countries, you'll generally get an idea on what that is. But it can really change. It can change rather significantly, especially continent by continent. Europe, you're probably seeing many of the same things going on, but sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, you can have one nation be doing very well, or having a grievance X, whereas the neighboring country has grievance Y. So region by region, I think you can see some of the similarities that are on there. I think what we always want to look at is country by country, because those are all often going to change as well. And whether the big things I look for are elections. What's coming up there with elections, because that's a lot of an indicator of those sources of discontent. And now those will be very clear as when you're doing a snapshot on those threats in those locations, what the grievances are, what the population is having situation is, what's going to drive civil unrest. I think that's going to change, year by year. Just to give you an example, Chile, pretty one of the few countries in Latam where we didn't historically see much in the way of civil unrest. 2019, that went the other way, and it went fast. So we can look at these regionally, but I think the most important way to do that is to look at them country by country. Unfortunately, I don't know any sources that put that together. But if you just kind of Google global risk mapping, you may be able to find some that are out there. There was an organization that just released their top 10 concerns for the remainder of the year. I think it was Crisis Group. So they may also have some regional information for you as well.
Yeah, we'll just say anecdotally, I worked a couple years ago with soldiers from civil affairs units and public affairs units and a couple others that were looking at ways of tracking sentiment in different regions. And that was the idea of mapping it came about. And the biggest problem was by the time you got the map or a heat map generated, it was null and void. It was obsolete because the sentiment can move that quickly. I think that's sort of along the lines of what you were saying. And I think we have one more that we can get to, also from Adil Khan, and how will societies be reformed as there appears to be a trend towards non-religion, meaning less of a probability going to church, etc. And I'm kind of interested to see if there would be a difference in a take on this from a critical infrastructure protection type of mentality.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm not aware on trends on non-religion or if that's going in one way or another. I mean, it would impact group dynamics, but I'm not exactly sure how. My take on people is, religion certainly is, a big part on group dynamics and how groups form and interact and what their value systems are, which drives actions. So I think that finds its way in our culture one way or another. And I'm not speaking good or bad on religion. I'm just speaking on the human dynamic. So if people are less likely to go to do religious activities, that could make an impact on things. I don't know how that's going to show up from a risk perspective, and I also don't know if that's replaced by some kind of other engagement in between individuals and promotion of values. It's a good question. It's something that I hadn't really thought much of. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, with that, I think that concludes our Q&A session for now. I'd like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to you, Jeremy. I know that you have been quite busy with international goings on, for lack of a better term. So I do appreciate you sticking it out and being able to perform this webinar. And I think that you are definitely well positioned to discuss this kind of thing with the community, with the Homeland Defense and Homeland Security community. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks everybody. One of the better Q&A sessions I've done recently, and thanks for those of you that have stayed on extra. Really enjoyed your time, and look forward to speaking with you again in the future. Best of luck to you all, and stay safe.
Thank you. And again, if anybody needs to see the webinar, needs the recording, you can go to HDIAC.org/webinars and see all of our past webinars there, and they are posted on our YouTube page. But with that, I will go ahead and go off the air, and the recording should be available within the next 48 hours. Thank you.